Hello everyone. My name is Sunil Pareek and today we will be discussing about private 5G or Wi-Fi in the enterprise architecture context. And this short tech talk, which I am expecting around somewhere around 15 to 20 minutes, is actually a conversation that had happened very recently during a business conference where I had an opportunity to meet with one business leader who was hearing all these hype around private 5G and was basically looking at its potential, and he wanted to understand that recently they had invested a lot in terms of revamping their infrastructure on Wi-Fi as well as enabling their team so that they can better manage it. So he wanted to understand that when private 5G is so promising, can it just replace Wi-Fi? And that is actually a very common questions, and I had already covered this in some of the previous lectures. Those are there on YouTube, and I can put that link in the description, and feel free to engage in the comments if something is not clear on those lines. But in brief, what I actually recommended to him that there is a technology that exists. You have private 5G, you have Wi-Fi. You actually look at your use case and then pick the technology rather than just looking at the technology and then see how it can solve your use case. So in that conversation, he had actually asked another interesting thing, and in fact, that is what we will cover in this lecture, is that how do you explain, Sunil, the private 5G architecture to a wireless guy? I have my team who knows the wireless. They are working on enterprise wireless. Now, if they need to deal with this, is there any similarities between the components those are being deployed in private 5G versus wireless, or it's a new technology altogether? So, and I had tried to explain him in the context of wireless world, how does the P5G work? So that will be the topic for us today. That first we will do the level set, like we will understand at a high level what Wi-Fi architecture for the enterprise looks like, and then we will look at 5G architecture and how it fit into the enterprise, and we will use the terminology around the wireless so that the enterprise people can understand. Again, this is not a lecture on the mobility side. I have kept it very, very light in terms of that. Now we will cover some of these topics separately. But if you are an enterprise engineer, uh, then this lecture should help you to understand the pieces that goes into a private 5G deployment and how you can relate those with the enterprise wireless deployment. And finally, we will conclude this with some takeaways. So first, the level set, as I was saying, for the Wi-Fi architecture for enterprise. And here, as you see, we have our APs, right? And they are broadcasting some SSIDs, let's say ABC, we all know this. And here I have my Wi-Fi endpoint where I am trying to log in with my ID, let's say sp@abc.com. So when I get onboarded into this wireless network, there is actually a complete backend network that help me to authenticate and that help me to authorize as well. And this is what this enterprise business leader wanted to understand, that currently they have a good authentication authorization mechanism in place for their enterprise, and they are using a lot of policies. So how does those policies, if at all they tomorrow go to private 5G, gets translated in that P5G deployment? So we will be focusing in this lecture on two things: how to authenticate and how to authorize, right? So now for this Wi-Fi, as we see that there is this WLC, the wireless LAN controller, and those of you who work in enterprise understand this very well. Apart from many duties like managing the APs, radio resource management, it also performs some other duties as well that we will be looking at. But first, let's look at the complete ecosystem. So you have your WLC, then you have your identity service engine. Again, I'm covering a enterprise deployment by Cisco, so that's why you see ICE here. And then ICE in the backend can be connected to the Active Directory, right? So now for an enterprise, this user, this SP at the rate abc.com, how it gets onboarded onto the wireless network. So first, basically what happens is that it has to authenticate itself, right? The user have to authenticate itself, and for that there can be a AAA server that is deployed, which have all the authentication parameters, and it can basically authenticate the end user. And this AAA server can talk in the backend with this Active Directory for all the subscription related informations, right? This can be Microsoft AD server, which have all the subscriptions and have a link to the AAA server, right? So with this ecosystem, this side of the ecosystem, this user gets authenticated. Again, I'm not going into the packet flow or the nitty-gritty details. There are already a lot of content that exists on internet about this, but the purpose of this video is to explain you these components and what exactly the similar or analogous components that we have in private 5G, right? So once you get authenticated, the next part is the authorizations, basically the policy framework. So for that, in ICE, we have another component that is the policy engine. Right? So what exactly this policy engine do? It actually program these switches, right? And then there can be multiple switches here in the enterprise network, right? So this actually program all these switches in terms of policy. What do I mean by a policy? So let's say Sunil, or this guy SP, is a IT employee, and he should be able to access the IT resources. If there are certain resources here which are belong to a finance department, or here can be HR, this user SP cannot access these, right? But it can access this. So this is in simple term a policy is, right? And for that we have this component called policy engine. And then this enterprise network can very well be connected to the internet, and with simple routing it can talk to the internet. Basically, this user can talk to internet. But here, look at this picture a bit closely before we move on. There is this authenticator feeds. Then we have the AAA. We have this Active Directory. We have the policy engine, and most importantly, we have this switch, right? I have drawn a switch here, but there can be multiple switches, right? But before we move on, just try to remember that these are the pieces which act as a critical role in the wireless deployment for an enterprise, right? Authenticator, AAA server, policy engine, and the switch. And then in the back end, somewhere there is this Active Directory, right? So now let's come to, with all these components in mind, now let's come to the 5G architecture. And again, you see a similar picture here. You have your WLC, you have your ICE, you have your Active Directory. But first, let's start from the endpoint side. So here, this endpoint is now a 5G endpoint, first of all. And then I have written here AP just so that we can understand, but it is actually a 5G radio. You can call it a 5G tower, 5G NR, but for the enterprise, just try to understand that this is that 5G AP. And instead of SSID, or you can call it analogous to SSID, it broadcasts a PLMNID, that is Public Land Mobile Network Identifier. It is actually basically identifier. So if you are using a Airtel phone, you get authenticate only to Airtel. If you are using a Geo phone, you get authenticated to Geo only. And don't worry, being an enterprise, we don't understand this, and that's not the purpose of this video as well. But for now, you just understand that this is a kind of SSID. You can very well relate to that, right? I will cover this in some other mobility lectures. But here, then this enterprise 5G, remember this endpoint, it has to authenticate and it has to authorize itself as well, right? That is what we had seen for a enterprise endpoint. And for that, there was this complete ecosystem that we had seen: WLC, ICE, Active Directory. So now just slowly let's open this piece and see what exactly the analogous to WLC in terms of 5G, right? So there we have this AMF, which stands for Access Management Function. We have SMF, Session Management Function, and UPF, User Plane Function, right? If you rewind this video, go to the previous slide, you have seen a switch here, but now we are not using any switch here, and I will tell you why in a minute. But AMF here is access management, basically to getting access to that network. That means it is performing some sort of authentication function, right? It is that same authenticator that we had seen in the previous slide, but that authenticator was connected to a triple A server, right? As you see in this slide as well. So what is analogous to the triple A server, right? Or the policy engine that actually in the enterprise, ICE was responsible for the AAA as well as the policy engine. But now in private 5G, what we see is you have AUSF, authentication service function, that is analogous to AAA server, and then the PCF, the policy and charging function, right? So this AMF is actually connected in the backend with this AUSF, and it performs the duty of that AAA server. Now you must be wondering that the AAA server was actually connected to the Active Directory as well, where I can put lot of subscription related information, right? So where exactly I can put that in the 5G or P5G world, right? So for that, what we have is UDM, Unified Data Management, and Unified Data Repository. So this is where in these repositories that subscription related information goes in, right? So now you see a connection between each of those components and their counterpart in a P5G deployment. Again, I have covered it at a very high level, but these are the system. Now let's come to the piece which we were talking here in the previous slide. If you look, there was a switch here in enterprise deployment. But in P5G, you can call this switch as a combination of SMF and UPF, right? Where SMF is actually your control plane function and UPF is data plane function. In the wireless world or in the enterprise, we all know what control plane is, what the data plane is, and here it is a combination of SMF and UPF for the control plane and the data plane. Then we have this PCF, which is policy and charging function, which is actually responsible for the policies. But at this point, this guy stopped me and he was asking that, okay, this is PCF, this is SMF, UPF. Okay, some of these components are mandatory to go with because 3GPP mandate these, right? So this is how the workflow work in P5G. But what about my existing policies? I have already invested a lot into my existing policies that I manage. So is there a provision where I can reuse some of my existing policies, let's say, or if not existing policies, I can use a similar framework? And I answered that with a yes, and he was happy and asking like explain it. So I told him that you can very well use your favorite eyes into the private 5G deployment as well. And he was asking like where exactly, and I was surprised by the depth that he was going, like at what level he can use eyes. So let's just see that. So with the 3GPP release, I think it was release 15, where they had made a provision for a secondary level authentication. So basically what happens is when these 5G endpoints get authenticated with the network, there can be a secondary level of authentication or authorization that happens before this endpoint get an IP address, right? So this SMF, the session management function, is responsible for allocating an IP address to this. But before SMF do that, it can very well be integrated with the ICE here, right? And again, we are looking at a Cisco deployment. So in that, for the secondary authentication authorization, you can have ICE integrated into this, and then with the help of ICE, you can very well manage your private 5G endpoints as well as your wireless endpoints. So that way you have this single point of policy management, right? And then this ICE can basically take care of the rest of the switches. So once the UPF, right, this is the data plane, this UPF can be connected to switches here, right? All the enterprise catalyst switches, and from here it can be connected to the internet, right? So I hope by now you have some idea about the workflow. Though I have not gone in depth, I have kept this lecture very light at a high level and covered the component in the wireless world versus the private 5G world, and we have compared them side by side, right? And regarding these, if you want to understand more on these components, don't worry, we will have a separate lecture, but that will be in our mobility section, talking about all these components in a bit more details. So give me some time, we will do that. And then basically we were towards the end of our conversation. So this business leader was asking that, okay, uh, this somewhat explain what the private 5G deployment looks like, but does his team need to go through or understand all these components? And there could be more. I had shown you this simplified diagram. There could be more of such VNFs. We are calling it as virtual network functions. All of these can be deployed on a server as a VNF, right? So do they need to understand all these components? Well, the answer to that is maybe yes or maybe not, because private 5G, and this is actually, I kept it as a key takeaway, right? Because this was the main message. After that, I had seen the smile on this gentleman's face, that private 5G provides you a lot of flexibility in terms of deployment, right? And one of the way for such category where the business leaders are not aware about this technology, their technical team is not much aware about this technology, they can go ahead and consume private 5G as a service. There are many vendors, including Cisco, those are there into this field, and they are providing it like as a service so that private enterprises can simply consume it, integrate it with their existing network, the way we had seen the integration with ICE, right? With that, I hope the information that I had provided was useful for you, and I would like to say thanks a lot for viewing.